My mother stood on my porch 9 years after she told me I was dead to her, holding a folder of medical bills, and said, "Family helps family." I remember thinking, where was that family 9 years ago when I was the one who needed help? But to understand how we got to that porch, I need to take you back to the dinner where my parents told me to choose between them and the man I loved. I was 23 years old when my father looked across the dinner table and told me that if I married Ethan, I should not expect to be welcomed in his house again. I want to explain, first, who my family was, because I don't think this story makes sense without that context. My parents built a life around a very specific idea of success. My father ran a mid-sized architecture firm his own father had started. My mother came from old money on her side, the kind of family with a name on a hospital wing 2 towns over. I grew up in a house with a circular driveway and a piano nobody really played, attending a private school where half my classmates had trust funds before they had driver's licenses. Ethan worked construction. He'd grown up 2 towns away in a small rental house with his mother, who cleaned offices at night to support him and his younger sister after his father left. We met at a friend's engagement party, of all places, an event where he was there helping set up tables for the catering company, and I was there as a guest in a dress that cost more than his weekly paycheck, a detail I didn't fully register until months later, when it started to matter to everyone except the two of us. I fell in love with him slowly and then all at once, the way people talk about it in movies, but that I never expected to actually happen to me. He was steady in a way most of the men I'd dated weren't, unbothered by things that seemed to consume everyone in my social circle, whose car was newer, whose internship was more prestigious, whose families summered where. Ethan worked with his hands and came home tired and satisfied in a way I found, honestly, a little foreign and a little magnetic. He fixed things. He built things. At the end of every day, he could point to something real he'd made, and I realized I couldn't say the same about most of the people I'd grown up around, myself included. Our first real date happened almost by accident. He'd taken my number that night at the engagement party, mostly, I think, because we'd ended up laughing together over a broken folding table he was trying to fix while half listening to a string quartet someone had hired for cocktail hour. He called 2 days later, sounding nervous in a way that surprised me, and asked if I wanted to get coffee. Nothing fancy, just coffee at a diner near his job site. I remember getting ready for that date and feeling, for the first time in years, like I didn't need to perform anything. He didn't know which university I'd attended before I told him. He didn't seem to care about the answer either way. We talked for 4 hours that first time, well past when his coffee had gone cold. He told me about his mother, about the 2 jobs she'd worked to keep him and his sister fed after his father left, about how he used to fall asleep some nights to the sound of her crying quietly in the next room, thinking he couldn't hay. He told me he'd started working construction at 16, not out of some romantic notion of building things, but because the money was steady and his family needed it. There was no self-pity in how he told it, just a plain accounting of a life that had made him who he was. I found myself, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious about another person's life instead of already knowing, in advance, exactly what kind of story they'd tell. I brought him home to meet my parents about 4 months into dating, naively hopeful that they'd see in him what I saw. My mother was polite in the specific, brittle way she reserved for people she'd already decided didn't matter. My father asked him, within the first 20 minutes, what his 5-year plan was, in a tone that made clear he already assumed the answer would disappoint him. Ethan answered honestly. He wanted to eventually run his own contracting business. He wanted to build a stable life, maybe start a family, maybe coach his kids' little league team the way his own absent father never had. It was, to me, a beautiful and completely reasonable answer. To my father, I could tell, it confirmed everything he'd already assumed. I remember the specific silence that followed Ethan's answer, the way my mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth, the way my father nodded slowly in a way that wasn't agreement at all but something closer to a verdict being finalized. Later that night, after Ethan had left, My mother came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was small and upset about something at school. She asked me, in a tone that was almost gentle, whether I'd really thought this through, whether I understood that people like Ethan and people like us wanted fundamentally different things out of life, whether I was prepared for what she called a much smaller life than the one I'd been raised to expect. I told her I didn't think love came with a price bracket. She smiled at me the way adults smile at children who say something naive, patted my hand, and left the room without another word. The comments started small after that first dinner. My mother would mention, seemingly out of nowhere, an eligible son of one of her friends, someone finishing his residency or clerking for a judge. My father took to referring to Ethan, when he thought I wasn't listening, as the contractor, never by name, as if naming him might grant him a permanence in our family my father wasn't willing to concede. I told myself, for a long time, that they'd come around once they saw how happy I was, once they understood that Ethan's character mattered more than his bank account or his last name. They did not come around. When Ethan proposed, 2 years into our relationship, in the small backyard of the house he was renting with two friends, I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. I called my mother that same night, still giddy, still holding out some small hope that this news might finally soften something in her. Instead, there was a long silence on the phone, and then she said, quite simply, "I hope you know what you're giving up." I didn't fully understand what she meant until the dinner a few weeks later, the one where my father delivered his ultimatum. He told me, in the same measured voice he used for business negotiations, that marrying Ethan would embarrass the family, that it would raise questions among people whose opinions apparently mattered more to him than my happiness. He said that if I went through with the wedding, I should not expect an invitation to Christmas, should not expect financial help if I ever needed it, should not, in his words, expect this family to bail you out of a decision you made with your eyes open. I remember asking him, quite calmly considering how much my hands were shaking under the table, whether he was actually asking me to choose between him and Ethan. He said he wasn't asking anything. He was simply describing consequences. I married Ethan 8 months later, in a small ceremony with 40 guests, none of whom were my parents. My mother sent a card. No gift, just a card, with a single line inside. "I hope this makes you happy, because it certainly won't make you comfortable." I kept that card for years, not out of sentimentality, but because some part of me needed proof, later, that I hadn't imagined how cold she could be. The years that followed were not easy financially in the specific ways my parents had predicted, though I don't think they predicted them out of concern so much as a desire to be proven right. Ethan and I started with very little. We rented a small 2-bedroom house with a leaking roof we couldn't afford to fix properly for the first year. I took a job at a marketing firm that paid considerably less than what my education had, according to my parents, entitled me to. We ate a lot of pasta. We argued about money more than I ever expected two people who loved each other could argue about anything. But I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for anyone listening who's ever been told that choosing love over approval is a mistake. Those were also, in many ways, the richest years of my life, richest not financially, but in every other sense that actually matters. Ethan and I built something entirely our own, without my parents' money, without their opinions shaping every decision, without a piano nobody played sitting in the corner of a house nobody felt at home in. When our daughter was born 3 years into the marriage, Ethan built her crib himself, from what he'd salvaged from a job site, sanding it smooth over 3 weekends until it didn't have a single splinter. I've never seen a piece of my parents' expensive furniture built with that kind of care. There was one person from my old life who never disappeared, and that was my younger sister, Claire. She'd been 19 when I got married, still living at home, still under our parents' roof and, by extension, their rules. She came to my wedding despite my father's explicit disapproval, sitting quietly in the back so as not to draw attention, and she cried harder than anyone else there when Ethan and I said our vows. 4 years afterward, she'd visit us in secret, telling our parents she was staying with a college friend for the weekend when really she was on our lumpy second-hand couch, eating the same pasta we ate 4 nights a week, watching Ethan patch the roof with a determination that, she told me once, made her furious on my behalf every time she thought about how our parents had described him. Claire was the one who told me, in fragments over those years, how our parents talked about us when I wasn't around. How my father would bring up my situation at dinner parties as a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying beneath your station, using my life as an anecdote for people who nodded along sympathetically over wine. How my mother had, at one point, told her own sister that she considered me temporarily lost, as though my marriage were a phase I might eventually recover from, like an illness. Hearing these things secondhand, through Claire, hurt in a strange, delayed way, like bruises that only ache once you notice them. My parents did not meet their granddaughter for the first 4 years of her life. I sent photos occasionally, more out of habit than hope, updates about milestones I suspected they'd never actually read. My mother sent one email back, when my daughter turned 2, with a single stiff line asking whether we needed money for daycare, an offer so transactional and so clearly designed to make a point about Ethan's inadequacy as a provider rather than genuine concern for my child, that I didn't even bother responding. Ethan's business, by then, was starting to genuinely take off. We didn't need their money. I think that fact bothered my mother more than any argument I could have made. Ethan's contracting business grew steadily over those years, the way real things built carefully tend to grow. By our 7th year of marriage, he had a crew of 12 working under him and a reputation in our town for reliability that brought in more work than he could take. We bought a house, modest but entirely our own, paid for with money we'd earned ourselves, decision by decision, without a single cent from either of our families. I remember standing in the empty living room the day we got the keys, Ethan's arm around me, both of us crying a little, thinking about every dinner conversation where my father had described this exact outcome as impossible. I didn't hear from my parents again in any meaningful way until 9 years after that ultimatum dinner, 9 years almost to the exact week, which I only realized later, when I looked back at the dates. My mother showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, looking older than I remembered, holding a manila folder against her chest like a shield. I almost didn't recognize her for a second, standing there in a coat that seemed too thin for the weather, her usual composure noticeably absent. She asked to come in. I let her, mostly out of shock, and she sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of table, I noted distantly, as the one where my father had once told me what I stood to lose. I noticed, in the strange, detail-obsessed way grief and shock make you notice things, that her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, that her rings, the same ones she'd worn my entire childhood, seemed to hang looser on her fingers than they used to. She opened the folder and slid it across to me. Inside were medical bills, my father's, spanning several months, along with paperwork about a business venture of his that had apparently collapsed 2 years earlier, taking most of their savings with it. She explained, in a voice stripped of all its old certainty, that my father had been diagnosed with a heart condition requiring ongoing treatment they could no longer comfortably afford, especially after the business failure had eaten through what should have been their retirement. She talked for almost 20 minutes before she got to the actual request, cycling around it the way people do when they already suspect the answer will be no. She told me about the specialists, about the medication costs, about how the house, the same house with the circular driveway I'd grown up in, was now at risk if they couldn't cover the next round of payments. I listened without interrupting, watching this woman who had once seemed unshakable to me slowly reveal just how fragile the foundation of her certainty had actually been all along. And then she said the words I mentioned at the start of this story: family helps family. I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I said anything, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what she was asking. She was asking me, the daughter she'd told to expect nothing from this family should she marry the man she loved, to now provide exactly the kind of financial support she'd once weaponized as a threat to control my choices. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, where this concept of family had been 9 years earlier, when Ethan and I were eating pasta 4 nights a week to make rent on a house with a leaking roof. I asked her where it had been when my daughter turned 1, 2, 3, and neither of her grandparents had bothered to acknowledge her existence beyond a single transactional email. I asked her whether she remembered the exact words she'd used on the phone the night I told her about the engagement, and watched her flinch slightly, which told me she did remember, whether or not she wanted to admit it. My mother's response was to say that things had been different then, that she and my father had believed I was making a mistake and had, in her words, handled it the only way we knew how. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, considered helping anyway, purely because he was my father and the idea of him suffering, even after everything, still landed some way soft in me. I thought about him teaching me to ride a bike in that circular driveway, before success had calcified into the rigid, conditional thing it later became. But then I thought about every Christmas Ethan and I had spent alone in our first years of marriage. Every milestone of my daughter's life my parents had chosen to ignore out of principle, every conversation where my father had made it clear that Ethan's worth was measured entirely by his bank account. And I understood, with a clarity that genuinely surprised me, that helping them now would mean confirming the exact belief that had caused all of it in the first place, that money determines who deserves care and who doesn't. I told my mother, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, that I was sorry about my father's health, genuinely sorry, because I don't think grief and anger have to cancel each other out. But I told her that the version of family she was invoking now, the one that helps unconditionally, was a version she and my father had explicitly rejected 9 years earlier, and that I wasn't willing to selectively apply that concept only when it benefited them. She left angrier, I think, than she'd been on the night of my wedding, because this time the rejection was coming from someone she'd assumed would always eventually cave. I didn't hear from her for several months after that visit. I want to pause here and talk about Ethan, because I think his response to all of this says something important. When I told him about my mother's visit that evening, expecting him to be angry on my behalf, he was instead quiet for a long time, sitting on the edge of our bed with his elbows on his knees, and then he said something I've thought about often since. He said that whatever I decided, he'd support it, but that he didn't want my decision to be driven by anger alone, because anger fades and leaves you with whatever choice you actually made underneath it. He asked me what I would regret more in 10 years, helping them or not helping them, separate from how satisfying either choice felt in the moment. I asked him, half joking and half genuinely curious, whether he wanted to help them, given everything they'd put him through, every dismissive comment, every year of being called the contractor instead of his name. He thought about it for a while before answering. He said that he'd built his entire adult life around not needing anyone's permission to be worthy, and that extending help to my father now, if I chose to, wouldn't cost him anything, because his sense of worth had never actually depended on my father's approval in the first place. It was, I remember thinking at the time, a far more secure position than either of my parents had ever occupied, for all their money. It was a fair question Ethan had asked, and I sat with it for weeks. Claire, when I told her, had a different reaction entirely. She'd watched our parents up close for those 9 years in a way I hadn't, had absorbed years of comments about my situation at family gatherings I wasn't invited to, had felt firsthand how our mother's coldness toward me had curdled, over time, into something closer to willful erasure. She told me she understood if I chose to help, but that she personally didn't think our parents had earned the right to my forgiveness that quickly, that 9 years of silence didn't dissolve just because they finally needed something. In the end, I did reach out to my father directly, not to offer money, but to have an actual conversation, something we hadn't done in nearly a decade. It was awkward and halting in the way conversations are after that much silence. He apologized, eventually, though I could tell it cost him something significant to do it, for the ultimatum, for the years of silence, for the email my mother had sent about Daikai that he admitted, almost sheepishly, he'd actually written the first draft of himself. I asked him, during that conversation, whether he'd ever regretted the ultimatum, even before the business failure, even before the medical bills, back when everything had seemingly gone according to his plan. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said there had been a specific afternoon, years earlier, when he'd seen a photo Claire had shown him without permission, a photo of my daughter's second birthday, a small backyard party with balloons. Ethan had blown up himself because we couldn't afford a party planner, and he'd felt something he didn't have a name for at the time. He said he understood now, looking back, that it had been regret, dressed up as disapproval, the whole time. I didn't give my parents money. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. What I offered instead was a conditional, carefully bounded reconnect ion, one built around actual accountability rather than a return to the old arrangement where their approval had always been the price of admission to my life. I told my father he was welcome to attend our daughter's next birthday, to start rebuilding a relationship with her from scratch, on the condition that neither he nor my mother ever again treated Ethan as anything less than an equal member of this family. I told him the medical bills were between him and my mother to solve, that I hoped he found a way through it, but that solving it wasn't going to become my responsibility simply because blood made it feel, to them, like it should be. It took over a year of slow, careful rebuilding before my mother could sit in my kitchen without a folder of demands in her hands, before my father could be in the same room as Ethan without that old, curdled condescension creeping into his voice. The first time my father shook Ethan's hand and called him by his actual name instead of a job title, I noticed Ethan's expression flicker with something complicated, not quite forgiveness, not quite triumph, something quieter than either. Progress, maybe. That's the word I'd use for it now. My parents did, eventually, find a way to manage the medical bills without our help. My father sold a piece of land he'd inherited decades earlier, land he'd apparently been sentimentally attached to for reasons I never fully understood, and used the proceeds to cover most of what the insurance didn't. I don't know if he resented having to do that instead of relying on us. If he did, he never said so out loud. And I decided a while ago that I wasn't going to spend any more of my energy managing his unspoken feelings about consequences he created himself. Ethan's business, for what it's worth, is now the largest contracting firm in our county. I think about that sometimes. How the exact thing my father once used to define Ethan's unworthiness, the label of the contractor, became the very success that outpaced my father's own career by the time it mattered. I don't say that with vindictiveness, though I won't pretend there isn't some quiet satisfaction in it. I say it because I think it's worth remembering. If you're ever told that the person you love isn't enough, that worth was never actually the thing being measured. Control was. My daughter is 12 now. She knows some of this story, the parts appropriate for her age, and she knows, more than anything, that her father built the life we have with his own two hands, one job at a time, without anyone's permission. Last year, she asked me directly why her grandparents hadn't been around when she was little, a question I'd been dreading since before she could talk. I told her the truth, in a version softened for a 12-year-old but not softened into a lie, that her grandparents had once believed love should come with conditions, and that it had taken them a long time and a hard year to understand why that belief had cost them so much. She sat with that answer for a while, and then asked whether I thought they understood it now. I told her I honestly wasn't sure, that some people learn a lesson permanently and some people learn it only for as long as the consequence is still fresh, and that we'd simply have to watch and see which kind my parents turned out to be. Claire eventually moved out of our parents' house entirely, into her own apartment 2 towns over, something I don't think would have happened as quickly if she hadn't spent 9 years watching, up close, exactly what our parents' conditional love had cost all of us. She tells me now that watching my marriage survive and eventually thrive, despite every prediction of failure, was the thing that finally gave her the courage to build a life our parents didn't approve of either, one centered around a career in social work that paid, in my father's old vocabulary, not very much at all. I like to think some part of what Ethan and I built gave her permission to want something other than approval. I think often about the difference between the two versions of my mother I've now known. The one who sat across from me at a wedding she refused to attend, sending only a card designed to wound, citing that her disapproval was a kind of protection I'd eventually thank her for. And the one who sat at my kitchen table 9 years later, hands trembling around a folder of bills, asking for the exact thing she'd once declared unavailable to me, permanently, as a lesson. I don't think she's become a fundamentally different person. I think circumstance simply forced her, for the first time in her life, to need something from someone she decided didn't deserve unconditional care. I don't know if she's ever fully reckoned with that irony. I've stopped waiting for her to. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. People who make love conditional on approval of your choices are not protecting you from mistakes. They are protecting their own comfort, their own image, their own certainty that they know better. Real family, the kind worth keeping, doesn't disappear for 9 years and then reappear only when it needs something from you. It shows up in the leaking roof years too, not just the years when you finally have something worth asking for. And if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, being asked to extend unconditional care to people who once withheld it from you as punishment, know that saying no isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the first boundary that finally teaches people what they should have understood all along.